The first time I met Priscilla Whitmore, she was standing in the middle of my driveway holding a clipboard like it was a holy relic and glaring at my fence like it had personally insulted her mother. "You can't just put up fences wherever you feel like it, Mr. Abram," she said, her voice high and tight like a kettle about to scream. "The HOA guidelines are very clear." I was carrying a box of tools back to the garage, still sweaty from digging post holes all afternoon, and I blinked at her like I wasn't sure if she was real. "You mean the fence along the ditch?" She nodded like she just caught me shoplifting. "Exactly. That is unauthorized construction on HOA property." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "That's not HOA property. That's a city-maintained drainage easement. The city even marked it for me when I called in the 811. Her nostrils flared. "That may be, but the HOA has jurisdiction over visual elements in the neighborhood. That fence violates our Uniform Appearance Clause." Uniform appearance? I looked down the street. Half the houses had chain-link fences, one guy had painted his bright blue, and another had what looked like an old boat hull wedged into his backyard as a decorative feature. "You're kidding, right?" Her lips pursed so hard they practically disappeared. "Expect a formal fine in your mailbox by the end of the week." And with that, she turned on her orthopedic heel and stomped back toward her beige SUV with the oversized HOA decal on the back window. I watched her go, then looked back at my fence. It was a plain, 6-foot wooden privacy fence, stained brown, sitting back from the sidewalk with a clear view of the stormwater ditch between my property and the street. I didn't even live in the HOA subdivision. My lot backed up to it, but I was just outside their official boundary. I only shared their entrance road. But Priscilla and her band of clipboard warriors had been circling my house like vultures ever since I moved in 6 months ago. At first it was little things, notes about non-compliant garbage can placement and excessive grass height, even though I mowed every Saturday like clockwork. Then it turned into veiled threats about community cohesion and maintaining property values. Now it was the fence. What Priscilla didn't know, bless her heart, was that I had spent 15 years as a city zoning inspector before retiring early to renovate houses on the side. I knew exactly where the property lines were, and I had called the city twice to confirm before I even bought the lumber. I didn't say anything else to her that day. I just waited. 3 days later, the envelope came, printed with the official seal of the Maple Hollow Estates HOA. Inside, a letter with Priscilla's signature at the bottom. "Dear Mr. Abram, this letter serves as a notice of noncompliance. Your newly constructed fence violates Article 4, Section 7 of the Maple Hollow HOA guidelines regarding property boundary structures. Failure to remove the fence within 10 days will result in a fine of $500 per day until compliance is achieved." It went on like that for 2 full pages. I almost framed it. Instead, I walked the letter over to City Hall. The clerk at the zoning desk, a guy named Marcus who I trained years ago, took one look at the letter and started laughing so hard he had to lean on the counter for support. "You're kidding me," he wheezed. "They're trying to fine you for fencing city-owned easement land?" I handed him the survey printout. "They don't know it's not even their jurisdiction." Marcus shook his head and started typing furiously. "I'm gonna escalate this." This isn't the first time someone from that HOA's tried to pull this crap. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a knock. I opened the door to find Priscilla standing there again, clipboard in hand. Lips tight, face pale. "I'm here to inform you that your fine has now reached $1,000 due to your refusal to comply," she said. I leaned against the door frame. "You sure about that?" She blinked. "Excuse me? I spoke to the city. That land isn't part of your HOA. It's municipal property. And according to them, you have zero authority to enforce anything beyond your borders." Priscilla's nostrils flared again, her go-to move when the world didn't bend to her will. "That land may be city-owned, but it's adjacent to HOA properties. That gives us visual jurisdiction." "Visual jurisdiction isn't a thing," I said. "You're making stuff up." She opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "You're clearly not interested in being a good neighbor." I smiled. "No, I'm just not interested in being bullied by a glorified yard cop." With a dramatic huff, she turned and stomped off, nearly tripping on the curb. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I came home from a supply run to find 2 uniformed men standing in my front yard with clipboards. They were wearing shirts with the HOA logo and little plastic badges clipped to their belts. One of them stepped forward. "Sir, we're here to inspect the non-compliant structure." I crossed my arms. "You're trespassing." The guy looked confused. "We were told this was HOA property." "By who?" "Queen Priscilla." He didn't answer. I pulled out a copy of the city zoning map, highlighted and labeled, and slapped it into his hands. "This," I said, pointing, "is the legal boundary of Maple Hollow Estates. This," I pointed to my property line, "is where your authority ends. You can't just..." "Don't finish that sentence unless you want a civil suit." The 2 men looked at each other. Then they shuffled off without another word. That afternoon, I got a call from Marcus at the zoning office. "Hey man, just a heads up, we're sending a city assessor out to your neighborhood this week. Someone from your HOA sent in a complaint claiming you were building across a protected drainage route." I laughed. "They're really reaching, huh?" "Oh, they're doing more than that," Marcus said. "They submitted falsified maps." My stomach dropped. "What?" "They edited the plat map to show your fence extending into the storm drain channel. It's not even subtle, they just photoshopped it. Poorly." I was quiet for a second. Then I said, "That's fraud." "Yup. And we're investigating it now. City legal is involved." I hung up, walked out to my yard, and stared at the fence. It looked the same as always, sturdy, clean, straight. But now it wasn't just a fence. It was a line in the sand. Priscilla had crossed it, and she was about to find out exactly how far I could push back. The city investigator's truck pulled up mid-morning 2 days later, a dusty white Ford with municipal plates and a rotating amber light on top. A man in his 60s with a clipboard and a limp stepped out, adjusted his ball cap, and scanned the street like he was checking for landmines. "Mr. Abram?" he called. "That's me," I said, walking over from where I'd been repainting the trim on the front window. The man extended a hand. "Name's Doug. Zoning enforcement. They sent me to look into that drainage complaint someone filed on your property." I handed him the folder I'd prepared copies of the original plat map, a surveyor's letter, and the city's easement document. Doug took one glance and whistled low. "Well, this already answers about half my questions," he said, flipping through the pages. "You're thorough." "Retired city inspector," I replied. "I don't like getting jerked around." Doug nodded, then turned to the fence. "Let's take a look." He moved slow but precise, measuring distances with a long tape, checking markers I'd flagged in orange paint, and taking photos from multiple angles. When he was done, he stepped back, scratched his chin, and pulled a small notepad from his pocket. "I've seen a lot of HOA nonsense in my time," he said, "but these people forged city maps and submitted them as evidence. That's a first. Any idea what happens next?" Doug looked over his pad. "I'll file a report with legal. They'll likely issue a cease and desist to the HOA's board. If they push this knowingly, someone's getting charged." I tilted my head. "Charged as in criminal?" He nodded once. "City property misrepresentation and document falsification. That's felony territory." I let that settle for a moment. The air was warm still. Somewhere down the block, a lawn mower coughed to life. Doug flipped his notepad closed. "They tried to make it look like you were encroaching on public infrastructure. If that had succeeded, they could have forced you to tear the fence down and possibly sue for damages. Only problem is your paperwork's airtight. Appreciate you coming out," I said. Before he could respond, a silver Mercedes rolled up and stopped crookedly at the curb. The window lowered, and there she was, Priscilla Whitmore, pearls, lipstick, and all. Doug raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess." She stepped out, holding a manila folder like it was radioactive. "Excuse me," she said, walking straight past me to Doug. "Are you with the zoning department?" Doug didn't answer. He just looked at her like she was an unexpected tax audit. I'm Priscilla Whitmore, chairwoman of the Maple Hollow Estates HOA, she said. I've brought the necessary documentation to prove this fence violates community guidelines. Doug held up his city ID. Ma'am, this isn't community property. It's municipal land. You're not in your jurisdiction. Priscilla's tone shifted instantly. Well, yes, technically, but aesthetically it impacts the neighborhood, and Doug interrupted, voice flat. We've already reviewed the legal documents. The claim you submitted was based on a doctored plat map. That's a criminal offense. Her eyes widened just for a second before she masked it with indignation. That must be a mistake. Our former secretary handled that submission. I wasn't aware. Doug pulled a copy from his folder and held it up. Your signature's on the bottom corner. She froze. You're going to want to contact an attorney, Doug said, turning back to me. Mr. Abram, I'll be in touch once the city finalizes the report. He got back into his truck, cranked the engine, and drove off, leaving Priscilla standing in the middle of my lawn. I looked at her. Still want to talk about visual jurisdiction? She didn't answer. Her face had gone pale beneath the makeup. She turned and left without another word. I figured that would be the last I'd see of her for a while. But I underestimated the lengths desperate people go to when they're cornered. 2 mornings later, I woke to a storm of texts from my neighbor, Carl, who lived 3 houses down. Hey man. Priscilla just had a bunch of HOA dudes out front walking your property line with measuring tape. I threw on jeans and a t-shirt and opened my door to find exactly that 3 middle-aged men in polo shirts pacing around my front yard. Eyes narrowed, measuring while spinning across my grass. I didn't even bother yelling. I just grabbed my phone and began recording. One of them noticed me and walked over, clipboard in hand. We're conducting a secondary review of the property line, he said, trying for official. Who authorized this? The HOA board. This isn't HOA land. He hesitated. We believe it may still fall under our revised community perimeter. Revised by who? He didn't answer. I kept recording. You're trespassing, I said. Get off my lawn before I call the sheriff. They left faster than they arrived. By noon, I had forwarded the footage to Doug and to Marcus at zoning. An hour later, I received a call from a detective with the city's fraud division. We've opened an investigation into the Maple Hollow HOA, she said. And we'd like to formally take your statement. I went down to the municipal building that afternoon. The detective's name was Lorna Tanaka, sharp suit, blunt tone, and the kind of eyes that didn't blink much. We sat in a beige interview room while she recorded everything. I handed over every document I had, including the video of the trespassers. She watched it, paused, and rewound the clip. That one, she said, pointing to a tall man with gray hair and aviator sunglasses. You know who he is? No idea. His name's Mitchell Crane. He's the HOA's treasurer. Background in real estate. Has a disciplinary record with the state licensing board. I raised an eyebrow. For what? Misrepresentation of property lines, she said. Now he's on your lawn trying to re-establish his own version of the truth. I leaned back in the chair. So what happens now? We've issued a subpoena for the HOA's internal communications, she said. If we find evidence they coordinated this knowingly, we'll pursue charges for conspiracy to defraud and unlawful trespass. Possibly more. By the time I got home, word had already started to spread. Carl was outside watering his lawn and waved me over. You might want to know, he said, lowering his voice. There's a meeting tonight, HOA board. Emergency session. They're panicking. I'm not even in the HOA, I said. Doesn't matter. You're the fuse they lit. That night, I parked across the street from the Maple Hollow Community Center and walked in, just as 30 or so residents were filing into folding chairs. The board sat behind a long table at the front. Priscilla was front and center, flanked by Mitchell Crane and a woman I recognized from one of the previous compliance walkthroughs. People were murmuring, restless. I stayed at the back. Priscilla cleared her throat. We've called this emergency meeting to address some recent misinformation regarding our authority over adjacent properties. Someone in the crowd stood up, an older man with a veteran's cap and crossed arms. You mean the criminal investigation? A ripple of agreement swept through the room. Priscilla straightened. That situation is being handled internally. It does not reflect the values of this community. Another hand shot up. Why are we spending HOA dues on legal fees for something you did? Priscilla ignored it. Mitchell leaned into the microphone. We acted in the interest of preserving property values. That is our mandate. From the back, I spoke up. You submitted forged maps to the city. That's not protecting value. That's committing fraud. Heads turned. A few people whispered. Priscilla's eyes narrowed. You're not a member of this HOA. You have no standing here. A woman in the second row stood. Actually, he has more standing than you right now. He's the reason the city is investigating this board. The room erupted. A dozen voices at once: demands for transparency, calls for resignations, accusations of misuse of funds. Someone banged a fist on a table. I walked out as the shouting escalated behind me. By morning, an email went out from the city clerk announcing the suspension of the Maple Hollow HOA's board pending investigation results. An interim board was to be formed by resident vote within 30 days. Doug called me later that week. They found enough in the subpoenaed emails to refer charges to the DA. Priscilla and Mitchell are both lawyered up. I stood in my backyard, looking at the fence. Still standing. Still right where it was supposed to be. Funny, I said. All that trouble over 6 feet of lumber. Doug laughed softly. Sometimes it's not the fence. It's what it represents. He wasn't wrong. 3 weeks after the emergency HOA meeting unraveled into uproar and stunned silence, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, just my name typed neatly across the front. I opened it on the porch, expecting maybe a leftover threat disguised as a courtesy notice. What I found instead were 6 blurry photocopies of email threads. At the top of each page, the HOA's official letterhead had been cropped out, but the names weren't redacted. I recognized them all. Priscilla, Mitchell, the secretary whose name I'd only seen at the bottom of the forged plat map. They were all there along with 2 other board members. The emails were time-stamped from 2 months before the fence incident even began. The subject lines were vague: drainage perimeter strategy, visual cohesion initiative, encroachment risk mitigation, but the content wasn't. They weren't just targeting me. They were building a quiet campaign to annex the city easement and expand the HOA's authority. One message even referred to creating a pattern of violations along the outer perimeter to justify jurisdictional reassessment. There were notes about staging temporary utilities near the easement, then claiming the area was actively maintained by the HOA. It was calculated, systematic, and it wasn't just about fences. It was a long game to absorb non-HOA properties into their control. I reread the email where Priscilla suggested aesthetic boundary enforcement as a way to wear down non-member resistance. That phrase hit me like a blowtorch to the ribs. I didn't know who sent me the envelope, but I knew what to do with it. That afternoon, I walked into the city attorney's office and handed the entire packet to Lorna Tanaka, the fraud investigator who'd taken my statement weeks earlier. She flipped through the pages without saying a word, then stood up and walked directly into a back office. I caught a glimpse of another man, gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, looking up from a stack of folders. She dropped the pages in front of him, pointed once, and said something I couldn't hear. 15 minutes later, she returned. "We're escalating this to the county prosecutor's office," she said. I raised an eyebrow. That fast? They've been tiptoeing around the edge of civil violations. This pushes them straight into criminal conspiracy, she replied. If these emails are authenticated, this isn't just document fraud anymore. It's coordinated property misrepresentation and attempted annexation without legislative authority. What's the penalty for that? Depends how deep it goes, she said, locking the folder into a bag. But if they tried to claim land they didn't own and filed it with the county, we're talking about real estate fraud. That's prison time. By the following week, the investigation had shifted into a new gear. A subpoena was issued for the HOA's financial ledgers, and a state-level forensic accountant was brought in to audit where the dues had been going. I didn't hear much for a few days, just vague murmurs from neighbors and a few awkward head nods from bored loyalists who avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Then, on a humid Wednesday morning, 3 unmarked vehicles rolled into the neighborhood and parked in front of Priscilla's house. 2 plainclothes detectives and a county investigator stepped out. One of them knocked once. The door opened halfway and then they stepped inside. I watched from across the street as computer equipment, files, and 2 large plastic evidence bins were carried out and loaded into the back of a van. The entire process took less than 40 minutes. When they came back out, Priscilla was in handcuffs. No one clapped. No one cheered. But 30 people stood on their porches or sidewalks, silent and still, watching the self-declared queen of neighborhood order get escorted down her own front steps. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Lorna. "We've arrested 3 members of the board," she said. Charges include conspiracy to defraud, falsification of public records, and attempted unlawful annexation of municipal land. "And the emails? Verified," she said. "Your fence was just the first domino. They were planning to use forged documents to rezone the easement and claim new properties as extensions of the HOA. That would have changed people's taxes," I said, "and given them control over properties that never agreed to HOA oversight," she added. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my phone warm in my hand. "What happens to the rest of the board?" "They're cooperating," she said. "Looks like a few of them were kept in the dark or misled. The treasurer, Mitchell Crane, is under separate investigation for misappropriation of funds. Looks like he was funneling maintenance budgets into a shell landscaping company registered under his cousin's name." I let out a low whistle. That explains the $3,000 tree replacement initiative that never happened. "There's more," she said. "We're preparing a civil action to recover misused funds and restore authority to the interim board. And the county's drafting a motion to bar the HOA from expanding beyond its original charter. Permanently, that's the goal." By the time the weekend rolled around, the neighborhood was buzzing louder than a July cicada swarm. A community bulletin was posted at the entrance, announcing a special election to reconstitute the board under city supervision. The interim chair was a soft-spoken woman named Josie Clark, a retired nurse who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and had never once attended a board meeting until now. "I just want people to mow their lawns, wave at each other, and not get sued," she told me on Sunday, holding a clipboard with a list of volunteer roles. "Is that too much to ask?" "Not at all," I said, signing up to help with the new landscaping committee. By Monday, yard signs had started popping up: accountability over authority, community, not control, and my personal favorite, no more clipboards. The city filed a formal complaint with the State HOA Regulatory Commission recommending the Maple Hollow Estates HOA be placed under long-term oversight. The commission responded with an emergency order, suspending the HOA's enforcement powers for 90 days pending the outcome of the criminal case. That meant no fines, no notices, no unannounced inspections. For the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. I had just finished trimming the hedge along the side of my driveway when Carl walked over, cold lemonade in hand. "Feels different around here," he said, offering me a glass. "Quieter," I replied. "No more tape measures in the bushes." "You see the news?" he asked. Crane tried to cut a deal. Offered to name outside contractors who helped doctor the documents. What did they say? DA told him to sit tight. They want everyone involved, not just the ones who signed the paper. I took a sip of lemonade, then nodded toward the edge of the street. Funny thing is, that fence? It was just to keep the neighborhood kids from falling into the ditch. Carl chuckled. Well, it kept the HOA from dragging the whole block into a scam, so I'd say it did more than its job. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows up the street. A few kids rode by on bikes, their laughter echoing off the pavement. Someone was grilling 2 houses down. Later that week, Doug stopped by in his city truck. He stepped out with a clipboard, an actual one, not the HOA kind, and walked over with a quiet grin. "We're officially redrawing the map," he said. "The city's reclassifying the easement as protected public land. That means no future HOA can ever claim it again." I stared at the updated map he handed me. The line was bold and clear. My fence sat comfortably inside my property. The rest, now shaded in green, bore 3 simple words: city maintained easement. Doug nodded. "You held the line." "No," I said, folding the map. "The law did. I just made sure they couldn't ignore it." He tipped his cap and left without another word. I walked back inside, closed the door, and for the first time since I'd moved in, I didn't look over my shoulder when I set down my keys. The board was gone. The fences stood. And the only thing left to do was mow the lawn, wave to the neighbors, and get on with life the way it should have been from the start. By the time the special election rolled around, Maple Hollow looked like a different place. The neighborhood signs, once polished weekly by board volunteers, had faded under the summer sun. The ornamental shrubs out front were overgrown. No one cared. After everything, a few wild hedges and cracked curbs were a small price to pay for peace. I hadn't planned to attend the election. I wasn't part of the HOA after all. But Josie Clark had stopped by the day before with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a tired, determined look in her eyes. "We need oversight from people who understand boundaries," she said, standing in my driveway as if the irony hadn't even occurred to her. I leaned on my rake and tilted my head. "You sure you want someone who never joined in the first place?" "I want someone who knows what happens when people forget where their authority ends." So I showed up. I didn't run, but I volunteered for the oversight committee, which would monitor the new board's actions for the next year. 5 residents were elected, none of them from the original board. One candidate tried to downplay her involvement with Priscilla, but someone in the crowd brought up a screenshot of an old newsletter she had signed as Assistant Director of Aesthetic Compliance. That ended her campaign before she reached the podium. The new board's first act was to pass a motion formally acknowledging the HOA's limited jurisdiction and disavowing any future attempts to annex non-member properties. It passed unanimously. I stayed just long enough to watch Josie bang the gavel and announce the end of the meeting. When I returned home, there was a voicemail waiting from Lorna Tanaka. "We've concluded the investigation into the Maple Hollow HOA," she said. "There's something you should see in person." I drove down to the county records building the next morning. Lorna was waiting just past the security checkpoint, a folder in one hand and a tablet in the other. She didn't offer any small talk. She just led me to a small room off the main corridor, closed the door, and laid the documents out on the table. "These are the sealed filings from the registrar's office," she said. "They were never meant to be public, but a whistleblower inside the HOA submitted them to our office last week." I scanned the pages. The headings were dry and bureaucratic: petition for boundary expansion, application for zoning reclassification, statement of visual impact. But the signatures weren't. Priscilla Whitmore, Mitchell Crane, and 2 names I didn't recognize, both from a law firm I'd never heard of. The documents were filed almost a year ago, months before the fence incident. One included a proposed amendment to the HOA charter that would have redefined adjacent properties with shared access as opt-in eligible, allowing the board to claim jurisdiction over lots like mine without a vote from the property owners. I looked up. They tried to rewrite the rules before they even started the campaign. Lorna nodded. And they did it through a third-party firm with no municipal authority. The plan was to submit the paperwork, enforce new rules quietly, and when no one objected, claim de facto governance. "That's not just dishonest," I said. "That's premeditated fraud." "It gets worse," she said, sliding over a second file. "We subpoenaed the firm. Turns out Mitchell Crane wired over $80,000 of HOA funds to retain them. None of it was disclosed in the budget. He funneled it through a shell account labeled Community Beautification Project. What's happening to him? He's already been indicted." Bail was denied due to flight risk. As for Priscilla, she paused, tapping the tablet. She's facing 5 counts of conspiracy to defraud, 2 counts of tampering with public records, and 1 count of unlawful attempt to alter zoning policy without legislative approval. Her attorney's trying to cut a deal, but the DA's not interested. I folded my arms. And the rest of the board? 2 pled guilty and are cooperating. 1 fled the state. We've got a warrant out. I sat back in the chair. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above us. Through the wall, I could hear the distant shuffle of paperwork and the occasional ring of a phone. They almost pulled it off, I said. They didn't, Lorna replied. Because you didn't let them. Outside, the streets felt different. Lighter, maybe? Or maybe I was finally able to walk them without waiting for someone to question the shade of my shutters. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now lingered in driveways, swapping stories with coffee in hand. The kids who used to cut through my yard on their way to the park now waved when they passed. A week later, I got a call from the city council. We're reviewing procedures for HOA oversight, said the councilman. We'd like your input as part of a new advisory board. I nearly laughed. You want me on a board? We want someone who knows how to hold one accountable. I agreed on one condition, that the board include representatives from non-HOA properties as well. If these groups were going to coexist, they needed to understand each other and draw lines they didn't try to erase later. 2 months passed. Then 3. The criminal cases moved slowly but publicly. The city published a formal statement outlining the changes in oversight and the requirement that all HOAs submit budget disclosures to a new municipal ethics liaison. It was small, but it was something. One afternoon, I was organizing the garage when Carl stopped by again, holding a brown envelope. This came to my house by mistake, he said. Looks like it's from the state licensing board. I opened it on the spot. Inside was a notice. Mitchell Crane's real estate license had been permanently revoked. The board had concluded their own investigation and found a pattern of deceptive practices inconsistent with professional conduct. Carl read over my shoulder. Took them long enough. You won't be flipping properties around here again, I said. Or trying to take over drainage ditches. We both laughed, the kind of laugh that came from surviving something absurd and exhausting and knowing it wouldn't happen again. Later that month, I finished the last coat of sealant on the fence. It had weathered its first year well, straight, sturdy, and now a symbol of something bigger than privacy. I stepped back, admired the work, and snapped a photo. The new board sent out a newsletter shortly after. No threats, no veiled language, just a list of upcoming events. A summer picnic, a community yard sale, a volunteer cleanup day at the park. At the bottom, a simple note from Josie. This neighborhood is not a kingdom. It's a community. Let's act like one. That night, I walked the block without a clipboard in sight. No measuring tapes, no passive-aggressive notices tucked under windshield wipers. Just porch lights, the hum of sprinklers, and the low chorus of crickets returning to their rightful place as the neighborhood's loudest voices. And for the first time since I moved in, I realized something. I didn't just win against the HOA. We all did.